Imagine setting up a hidden camera in your own home because you suspect someone is stealing from you, only to return and find the camera ripped down and your money gone. This is exactly how the chaotic saga of Matthew Abrahamson and Josh Pritchard began. Today, we are diving deep into one of the most intense and emotionally charged cases ever seen in Judge Judy's courtroom. It starts with a brutal physical assault that resulted in a legal order of protection. But the backstory is a tangled web of family betrayal, drug accusations, and a broken slot machine. Matthew stands before the judge, admitting he beat Josh up, but his justification is a mix of righteous anger and protective instinct. He claims Josh is a stoner who is leading his young sister-in-law, Molly, down a dark path of dependency. On the afternoon of September 14, 2015, Matthew's home security was breached. He had slot machines in his computer room, and when he found them smashed open and the cash missing, his mind went straight to one person, Josh. But in a court of law, suspicion isn't proof. To bolster his claim, Matthew brings forward a surprising witness, his own 13-year-old son. The boy describes coming home early from school to pick up a forgotten photo form and seeing a car that looked exactly like Josh's pulling into the driveway. This testimony sets the stage for a massive confrontation. Judge Judy, known for her sharp tongue and zero tolerance for vigilante justice, immediately zeroes in on the core issue. Even if the car was there, did anyone actually see Josh take the money? The tension in the room is palpable as the history of these two families begins to unravel, revealing that this wasn't just about a few dollars. It was about a deep-seated hatred that was about to explode. The atmosphere in a courtroom usually shifts when a judge stops looking at the evidence and starts looking at the person standing right in front of them. In this case, that person was 19-year-old Molly. While the legal battle was technically about a physical assault and a broken slot machine, Judge Judy sensed that there was a much deeper, more troubling story hidden beneath the surface of this family feud. As Molly stood there, her eyes filling with tears, the case took a sharp turn away from the violence of the past and into the harsh reality of her present life. Judge Judy, known for her no-nonsense approach to life and work, began to peel back the layers of Molly and Josh's daily existence. And what she found was a picture of total dependency that seemed to baffle her. Molly explained that she had moved out of her family home and was now living with Josh in the house of an elderly woman, whom they described as a sort of grandmother figure. But the details of how they survived day-to-day were what caught the judge's attention. They weren't paying rent in the traditional sense, and neither of them held a job. Molly, still a teenager, was enrolled in an online high school program based in Minneapolis, a choice that meant she rarely had to leave the house. When Judge Judy asked how they bought food or paid for their basic needs, the answer was a combination of government assistance, EBT cards, and Social Security disability. For a judge who has spent decades seeing people struggle to make ends meet through hard work, this lifestyle felt like a tragedy in the making. The focus then shifted heavily onto Josh Pritchard. Josh claimed that he was unable to work because of a congenital back condition, a birth defect that caused him chronic pain and resulted in a neurosurgeon placing him on a strict 10-pound weight restriction. He argued that in the small county where they lived, there simply weren't any jobs available that didn't require physical labor. However, Judge Judy wasn't buying it for a second. She challenged him immediately, pointing out that in the modern world, there are countless jobs that involve sitting at a desk, answering phones, or working on a computer, none of which require lifting heavy weights. The tension escalated as it became clear that the judge viewed Josh not just as a victim of an assault, but as a young man who had given up on himself and was taking Molly down with him. Molly's emotional breakdown reached its peak when the conversation turned to her sister. Because of the bad blood between Josh and Matthew, Molly had become completely alienated from her own flesh and blood. She hadn't spoken to her sister in months, caught in a loyalty trap where choosing Josh meant losing her family. Matthew's earlier claim that Josh was a stoner leading Molly down a bad path suddenly had a different context. While Matthew's violence was inexcusable, his perspective as a protective brother-in-law began to make sense to the gallery. Even if his methods were criminal, he saw a young girl with her whole life ahead of her dropping out of physical society to live on Government checks with a man who claimed he couldn't even lift a gallon of milk. Judge Judy's questions weren't just about legal facts anymore. They were a wake-up call. She asked Molly if she truly felt that this was the right trajectory for her life. Molly's tearful yes was one of the most heartbreaking moments of the entire case. It revealed a young woman who was so deeply entrenched in her current situation that she couldn't imagine a world where she was independent, employed, and connected to her family. This part of the trial highlighted the invisible damage that family feuds cause. It wasn't just about the bruises on Josh's face or the missing money in Matthew's slot machine. It was about the future of a 19-year-old girl who was being used as a pawn in a war between two men who couldn't find a way to communicate like adults. The courtroom watched in silence as the judge dismantled the excuses. She didn't care about the neurosurgeon's note as much as she cared about the lack of effort. To her, a man who can stand in a courtroom and argue his case for an hour is a man who can sit in a chair and earn a living. This segment of the case served as a stark reminder that in life, your choices define you just as much as your circumstances do. As Molly wiped her eyes, the focus returned to the legal matter at hand. But the image of their struggling, dependent lifestyle remained etched in everyone's mind. It set the stage for the next big question. Did this desperate need for money provide a motive for the alleged theft that started this whole mess? The underlying resentment between Matthew and Josh wasn't just about a one-time fight. It was built on months, perhaps years, of Matthew watching Josh live off the system while dating his sister-in-law. Every time Matthew saw Josh, he didn't just see a man he disliked. He saw someone he perceived as a burden and a bad influence. This emotional pressure cooker is what eventually exploded on that September afternoon. When the slot machine was broken into, Matthew didn't see a mystery to be solved. He saw a confirmation of everything he already believed about Josh's character. He didn't need a fingerprint or a confession. In his mind, the lifestyle Josh led was all the evidence he needed to justify the violence that followed. The intensity of the courtroom reached a boiling point as the focus shifted to the most critical piece of evidence in the entire case, the eyewitness. This wasn't just any witness. It was Matthew's own 13-year-old son, a young boy thrust into the middle of a high-stakes legal battle between his father and his aunt's partner. As the boy stood up to testify, the room went silent. This was the moment where the he said, she said arguments were supposed to end and the objective truth was supposed to emerge. The boy's story was simple but devastating. He explained that on the morning of September 14th, he had headed off to school just like any other day. However, a small mistake, forgetting a picture form, forced him to return home unexpectedly. It was during this brief, unplanned trip back to the house that he saw something that would change everything. A car pulling into the driveway. Judge Judy, with her years of experience in reading people, didn't just take the boy's word at face value. She began a meticulous line of questioning that was designed to separate what the boy actually saw from what his father might have suggested to him later. She asked about the timing, the color of the car, and the specific location where the vehicle was spotted. The boy was firm. He knew the car. He believed it belonged to Josh Pritchard. But here lies the legal tragedy of the situation. While the boy saw a car, he admitted under the judge's sharp gaze that he never actually saw Josh get out of the car. He never saw Josh enter the house. He never saw anyone touching the slot machines or carrying away a heavy load of coins. The evidence was circumstantial at best, a mere shadow of proof. Yet, for Matthew, this shred of information was all the gasoline his fire needed. Instead of acting like a rational citizen and calling the local authorities to report a suspected burglary, Matthew allowed his rage to take the driver's seat. He didn't wait for a police investigation. He didn't wait for forensic evidence. He took the law into his own hands with a level of aggression that shocked the court. Matthew tracked down Josh and delivered a physical beating that went far beyond a simple scuffle. This wasn't just a push or a shove. This was a violent assault that left Josh with visible injuries and a deep sense of fear. In Matthew's mind, he was a hero defending his home and his family's honor. In the eyes of the law, however, he had transformed from a victim of theft into a common criminal. The physical clash between these two men represented more than just a fight over money. It was the climax of a long-standing cultural and personal divide. On one side, you had Matthew, a man who clearly valued hard work, property, and traditional family structures. On the other side, you had Josh, a man who lived a lifestyle Matthew fundamentally despised. When Matthew swung his fists, he wasn't just hitting Josh because of the slot machine. He was hitting him for everything Josh represented in his eyes. He was hitting him for the perceived bad path he was leading Molly down. He was hitting him for the stoner lifestyle he suspected him of leading. But Judge Judy was quick to point out that in America, you don't get to beat people up just because you don't like their lifestyle or because your 13-year-old saw their car in your driveway. Josh's testimony about the assault was harrowing. He described the moment Matthew confronted him, the lack of a chance to explain himself, and the sheer force of the violence. He argued that the injuries he sustained that day didn't just hurt him physically. They destroyed his ability to maintain his employment. He had been working at a casino, a job that required him to be on his feet and active, and he claimed that after the beating, he simply couldn't perform his duties anymore. This added a layer of financial desperation to Josh's side of the story. If he couldn't work because of the assault, then Matthew was responsible for his current state of poverty. It was a vicious cycle. Matthew beats Josh because he thinks Josh is a thief. Josh becomes unable to work because of the beating, which only reinforces Matthew's belief that Josh is a lazy person living off the system. The courtroom drama intensified when Judge Judy turned her attention back to the slot machines. She wanted to know the mechanics of the theft. How much money was really there? Was it enough to justify this level of animosity? Matthew claimed the machines were his way of saving money, a hobby that also served as a piggy bank. But the lack of a police report for the theft was a massive red flag for the judge. If you are truly a victim of a crime, the first thing you do is call 911. You don't wait for a convenient moment to enact street justice. By failing to involve the police, Matthew had effectively sabotaged his own claim. He had no official record of the theft, no crime scene photos, and no fingerprints. All he had was a son who saw a car and a heart full of vengeance. As this part of the trial concluded, the moral lines were becoming increasingly blurred. The audience was left wondering, can you really blame a man for being angry when he thinks he's been robbed by a family member? But on the flip side, can you ever justify a grown man brutally attacking another person over a suspicion? The weight of the physical evidence, the bruises and the medical reports, favored Josh. The emotional evidence, the broken home and the missing savings, favored Matthew. But the law doesn't care about emotions. It cares about the fact that Matthew broke a fundamental rule of society. You cannot be your own police force. This violent encounter led directly to the protective order, setting the stage for the next phase of their legal war, the battle over a single aggressive look. He was hitting him for everything Josh represented in his eyes. He was hitting him for the perceived bad path he was leading Molly down. He was hitting him for the stoner lifestyle he suspected him of leading. But Judge Judy was quick to point out that in America, you don't get to beat people up just because you don't like their lifestyle or because your 13-year-old saw their car in your driveway. Josh's testimony about the assault was harrowing. He described the moment Matthew confronted him, the lack of a chance to explain himself, and the sheer force of the violence. He argued that the injuries he sustained that day didn't just hurt him physically. They destroyed his ability to maintain his employment. He had been working at a casino, a job that required him to be on his feet and active, and he claimed that after the beating, he simply couldn't perform his duties anymore. This added a layer of financial desperation to Josh's side of the story. If he couldn't work because of the assault, then Matthew was responsible for his current state of poverty. It was a vicious cycle. Matthew beats Josh because he thinks Josh is a thief. Josh becomes unable to work because of the beating, which only reinforces Matthew's belief that Josh is a lazy person living off the system. The courtroom drama intensified when Judge Judy turned her attention back to the slot machines. She wanted to know the mechanics of the theft. How much money was really there? Was it enough to justify this level of animosity? Matthew claimed the machines were his way of saving money, a hobby that also served as a piggy bank. But the lack of a police report for the theft was a massive red flag for the judge. If you are truly a victim of a crime, the first thing you do is call 911. You don't wait for a convenient moment to enact street justice. By failing to involve the police, Matthew had effectively sabotaged his own claim. He had no official record of the theft, no crime scene photos, and no fingerprints. All he had was a son who saw a car and a heart full of vengeance. As this part of the trial concluded, the moral lines were becoming increasingly blurred. The audience was left wondering, can you really blame a man for being angry when he thinks he's been robbed by a family member? But on the flip side, can you ever justify a grown man brutally attacking another person over a suspicion? The weight of the physical evidence, the bruises and the medical reports, favored Josh. The emotional evidence, the broken home and the missing savings, favored Matthew. But the law doesn't care about emotions. It cares about the fact that Matthew broke a fundamental rule of society. You cannot be your own police force. This violent encounter led directly to the protective order, setting the stage for the next phase of their legal war, the battle over a single, aggressive look. Just when you think a case couldn't get more personal, it shifts from the realm of physical violence to the realm of psychological warfare. Following the assault, the court had issued a formal order of protection. This was a legal keep-away sign meant to ensure that Matthew and Josh would never have to interact again. However, in a small town or a tightly knit social circle, total avoidance is often an impossible dream. Josh Pritchard returned to the courtroom not with new bruises, but with a claim that Matthew had violated the protective order through the power of his presence and his eyes. It was an accusation that forced Judge Judy to define the very limits of what contact actually means in the eyes of the law. Josh's claim was specific. He described an incident where he and Matthew happened to be in the same public space. According to Josh, Matthew didn't say a word. He didn't move toward him. He didn't make a gesture. Instead, he simply stood there and stared. Josh characterized this as aggressive eye contact, a deliberate attempt to intimidate him and remind him of the violence that had occurred months prior. For someone who has been the victim of a brutal beating, a look isn't just a look. It's a threat. It's a way of saying, I'm still here, and I'm still watching you. Josh argued that this stare was a clear violation of the order, meant to keep him safe, claiming it caused him significant emotional distress and made him feel like he was constantly being hunted. Matthew's reaction to this was one of pure, unadulterated scoffing. He looked at the judge as if the accusation was the most ridiculous thing he had ever heard. His defense was simple. I have eyes, and I have to look somewhere. He argued that he wasn't stalking Josh. They simply lived in the same area. If their paths crossed, was he supposed to close his eyes and walk into a wall? Matthew maintained that Josh was using the protective order as a tool of harassment, turning the legal system into a way to get back at him for the initial conflict. In Matthew's view, Josh was being sensitive and manipulative, trying to trap him in a legal technicality for the simple act of existing in public. Judge Judy now found herself in a fascinating position. How do you rule on a stare? She had to weigh the reality of Josh's fear against the practicality of Matthew's right to move freely. She began to probe the details of the encounter. How long did the stare last? What was the distance between them? Was there any other behavior, like following or blocking a path? The nuance of this discussion highlighted a common issue in protective order cases: the gray zone. While the law is clear about phone calls, emails, and physical distance, it is much less clear about the psychological impact of a mean look. Josh insisted that the look was a weapon, while Matthew insisted it was an accident of geography. The debate then shifted to the concept of fear. To prove a violation of an order based on non-physical contact, the victim often has to prove that the behavior served no legitimate purpose and was intended to harass or terrify. Josh pointed back to the original assault. He reminded the court that Matthew had already proven he was capable of extreme violence. Therefore, any interaction, no matter how silent, carried the weight of that past trauma. For Josh, the stare was a reminder of the hospital bills and the pain. But for Matthew, the accusation was just more proof that Josh was the troublemaker he always thought he was. He felt that Josh was playing the victim to distract from the original theft of the slot machine money. As the testimony continued, the divide between the two men felt wider than ever. It was no longer about a slot machine or a fight. It was about two men who had completely lost the ability to see each other as human beings. They saw each other as symbols. Josh saw Matthew as a looming shadow of violence, and Matthew saw Josh as a parasitic thief who was destroying his family. Every glance, every word, and every court appearance was just another volley in a war that had no clear end in sight. The eye contact incident became a metaphor for the entire case, a situation where the truth was entirely dependent on whose eyes you were looking through. Judge Judy's frustration was visible. She had two men in front of her who were wasting the court's time with petty grievances because they couldn't find a way to stay out of each other's orbits. She began to lecture them on the cost of their animosity, the legal fees, the time away from work, the stress on Molly and the rest of the family. It was all adding up to a price that was far higher than the few $100s taken from a slot machine. This part of the case served as a warning to anyone who thinks the legal system is a place to settle personal vendettas. The law is a blunt instrument, and when you use it to attack someone else, you often end up getting hit by the recoil yourself. The stage was finally set for the final judgment, a decision that would attempt to bring some semblance of order to this chaotic family explosion. After hours of testimony, emotional outbursts, and technical legal arguments, the time had finally come for Judge Judy to deliver her final decision. This wasn't just about who won or who lost. It was about restoring a sense of boundaries to a situation that had spiraled completely out of control. The judge looked at Matthew and Josh, two men who had allowed a single afternoon in September to define the next year of their lives, and she didn't hold back. Her verdict was a masterclass in balancing the letter of the law with the reality of human nature. She had to address the theft, the assault, the protective order, and the future of the young woman caught in the middle. First, she addressed Matthew Abrahamson. She acknowledged his frustration and his belief that he had been wronged. However, she delivered a crushing blow to his defense of home protection. She told him in no uncertain terms that his decision to assault Josh Pritchard was a criminal act that overshadowed any grievance he had. Because he didn't call the police, he had no proof of a crime, which meant his attack was legally unprovoked. She ordered Matthew to pay damages to Josh for the medical bills and the pain caused by the assault. It was an expensive lesson for Matthew. In a civilized society, your fists are never a substitute for a phone call to the authorities. His castle was not above the law, and his rage had cost him both his money and his moral high ground. Then, she turned her gaze toward Josh Pritchard. While he was the winner in the assault claim, he was about to receive a lecture he would never forget. Judge Judy addressed the eye contact violation and the claims of being unable to work. She made it clear that she didn't fully buy his victim narrative. She looked at his lifestyle, living off the government, staying at home all day, and discouraging a 19-year-old girl from finishing her education and joining the workforce, and she called it what it was, a tragedy. She told Josh that while he was legally protected from Matthew's violence, he was not protected from the consequences of his own choices. She suggested that his inability to work was more about a lack of will than a lack of physical ability, and she warned him that the government checks wouldn't last forever. The most poignant part of the judgment was reserved for Molly. Judge Judy spoke to her not as a judge, but as a woman of experience. She told Molly that she was at a crossroads. She could continue down this path of dependency, alienated from her sister and her family, or she could choose a different trajectory. The judge pointed out that Molly was young, smart, and capable, but she was being suffocated by the drama between these two men. She encouraged her to look beyond the immediate conflict and think about where she wanted to be in 5 years. Did she want to be sitting in a courtroom, crying over slot machines and mean looks, or did she want to be out in the world, building a life of her own? It was a moment of uncharacteristic softness from the judge, a plea for a young person to save herself from a toxic environment. As for the protective order, Judge Judy decided to let it stand, but with a stern warning. She told Josh that he could not use the order as a hook to get Matthew in trouble for every coincidental meeting. She told Matthew that he needed to treat Josh like a ghost, someone he doesn't see, doesn't talk to, and doesn't acknowledge. The eye contact was dismissed as a technical violation that didn't warrant further punishment, but it served as a final reminder of how petty their conflict had become. The judge's message was clear: stay away from each other, move on with your lives, and stop making your personal problems the court's problems. The case ended with no handshakes and no reconciliations. Matthew walked out feeling cheated. Josh walked out feeling vindicated but insulted. And Molly walked out still caught in the middle. It was a stark reminder that the legal system can settle a debt or punish a crime, but it cannot fix a broken family. The scars of that September afternoon would likely remain for years, not because of the physical wounds, but because of the deep-seated resentment that neither man was willing to let go of. The slot machine was empty. The money was gone, and in the end, the only thing they had truly gained was a permanent record of their mutual hatred. Now that we've reached the end of this roller coaster case, I want to hear from you. This story has so many layers: the suspicion of theft, the brutal assault, the lazy lifestyle, and the technicalities of the law. Who do you think was the real villain here? Was it Matthew for taking the law into his own hands? Or was it Josh for the lifestyle he led and the suspicion he brought upon himself? And what about the eye contact violation? Do you think the law should punish someone for a stare? Or was Josh just being too sensitive? This is a case that divides people every time they see it. So let's get a discussion going. Drop your advice for this family in the comments. What should they do to finally find peace? Don't forget to share your take on the final verdict.